all, thank you very much, Professor Rajesh, for inviting us and to constitute this panel for us. And let me also thank Professor Kundu for moderating this panel and my fellow colleagues for coming along and presenting different papers, which all actually culminates into this central idea of entrepreneurial adaptation in emerging markets. So it's a team working on different research projects. And the central idea here is to highlight how emerging market firms are adapting to an environment which is highly uncertain and resource constrained. So that's the basic outline, I will say, with which we would be presenting our panel discussion. So the very first paper that is very close to acceptance, it will be published very soon. It has, with minor revise and resubmit, it has already been submitted these to the journal. And these are the co-authors with whom the work has been led. Work was led by Professor Patnaik anyway. As you can see here, he is the first author here. And it looks at how institutional changes in emerging markets are affecting firms' growth. And in particular, how these firms are adapting to those changes and how they are reconfiguring their resources, how they are deploying their resources in order to grow. And this is a case study that we have picked up from the Indian higher education sector, because as you would all understand, a lot of changes has happened in the Indian educational landscape over the last 3 decades. And that actually goes up to the new education policy that was recently launched by the Prime Minister Modi last year itself. So starting with this puzzle, how these institutional changes are happening and how are they affecting, we went into looking at the literature, which I guess most of you would understand anyway. Institution obviously affect the organization in many ways. It is in fact considered by scholars such as Mike Peng, etc., as a third leg for the strategic tripod, because without looking at institutional, the strategy will always fall. So it provides stability to the organizational strategy. It also predicts, institutions also predicts, that's the key work by DiMaggio and Powell, who says that organization needs to adhere to the unilateral framework within which these firms are embedded. And they will all have to be homogeneous in terms of their behavior, in terms of what they do, what is allowed and what is not allowed, which means that organizations should be looking outward towards the changes that are happening and try to devise the strategy which can help them follow and legitimize their practices to the external institutional environment. And what essentially it means that organizations will essentially look like similar kind of the animals. So they will be more like homogeneous. They will behave similarly because the institution will prohibit them to do certain things. Institution will incentivize to do certain things. And essentially what you would predict, that organizations will not do certain things and organizations will do certain things because that's where the incentives would lie. So that's, I think, a one side thing that we can clearly understand what institutional theory talks about for organizations. Now, if that is the case, then the question is, how does then the organizations differ from each other? And I guess you can easily answer that question, which is, if you look at the resource-based, which talks about that the firms have bundle of resources, managers try to exploit these resources in such a way that they could derive firm performance. So obviously there is a bigger institutional landscape which provides the framework within which the organizations will work. And within that, the entrepreneurship, as in the managers, would act in such a way that they would create heterogeneity among firms, with their peers, and that's how they would progress. There is a recent paper that was being published in Journal of Management by Nassen and Wiklund, and talks about it's a review paper. It talks about the resource-based view. Essentially, if you look at the resource-based view, two dominant perspective, two dominant school of thoughts or views that emerges are Barney's view, which talks about the resources, the VRIN criteria in particular, and the Penrosian view, which emphasizes on the managers and the managerial capabilities or ingenuity, which actually make good use of these resources, because resources by themselves are not dynamic. They would be static. They would be affected by the outside institutional changes. Sometimes the organizational resources may become obsolete because the technology or the government policies have changed and you can't really use them anymore. Or sometimes the organizational resources may gain value because the policies have become favorable, and things that you could not have used prior, now you could use. And that's where the managerial ingenuity lies, that would predict some of these changes and make use of those resources. And that is obviously one of the key outcomes that we have been trying to figure out from this research work. If you compare the RBV and IBV, you could clearly see that there's a lot of contradictions within these two theoretical paradigms, talking about heterogeneity versus isomorphism, talking about inward versus outward looking, and talking about differentiation, which is the RBV's view, to differentiate with peers by utilizing resources, against the standardization or adaptation, which is the outlook of the IBV, as in the firms need to adapt and standardize according to the external institutional environment. So these are some of those theoretical things with which you can actually study the entrepreneurial adaptation and the entrepreneurial practices that are being practiced by firms. And I was recently reading this work by Nikolai Voss, happens to be a good friend of ours, and he was trying to look at the idea of strategic entrepreneurship. So what is strategic entrepreneurship? If you look at the IBV and the RBV within which the firms do what they do, and some of these things can be captured with strategic entrepreneurship. So what it essentially means is that the firms deploy resources when they are serving market, and they deploy these resources in such a way that will lead to maximization of the value creation that these firms do while interacting with the external institutional environment. So basically, if you look at entrepreneurship per se, that's quite different from what is strategic entrepreneurship, because strategic entrepreneurship is actually focusing on the external institutional environment while making use of those resources, which in general entrepreneurship we would not consider. And you could, by extension, then look at the dynamic capabilities view, which essentially talks about some of these ideas in terms of the managerial ingenuity with regard to scanning the external institutional environment, making sense of these changes, and then adapting to these changes, and seizing opportunities, reconfiguring resources, and so on. So I think with that, we were trying to make a conceptual diagram of how these things actually pans out in practice, and that's how you could see or understand what we have tried to achieve in our paper. So on one side, you have the organization with the bundle of resources, and here we are talking about the VRIO or VRIN criteria, the resources criteria of RBV, and on the right-hand side, you have the organizational growth. So obviously, the resource base will lead to organizational growth, and there is a direct relationship between them. And here we are talking about the institutional changes now, which are indeed outside the boundary of the firm, and they are affecting the growth of the firm, as I said about the legitimization practices and confirming the institutional changes. So that's what it is. But at that same time, you could see that the institutional changes would also affect on the whole resource base itself. So that's the exogenous shock. And on the inside within the firm, you have some kind of dynamic capabilities which firm will deploy in order to address to those changes. So there is a mitigating effect on growth, and then there is a mitigating effect of dynamic capabilities again against the institutional changes on the resource base itself. And I would say that the whole gray box here would be seen as the strategic entrepreneurship, which actually encompasses the resources, the growth side, the value creation side, and the managerial ingenuity in terms of the dynamic capabilities, which leads to the growth of the firm. So I guess that's the basic theoretical idea where we have tried to synthesize the literature and bring it to close to the strategic entrepreneurship literature, which is still evolving. And we conceptualize this with the help of, operationalize this with the help of a case study, which my colleague, Professor Patnaik, would now talk about.
Thank you, Professor Munjal. Okay, this is part of a larger study that we are undertaking, wherein we are focusing our attention on private business schools. Private business schools now occupy a specific landscape in higher education sector in many countries. I mean, we see some changes happening here as well. But yet, not much has been worked on private business schools, their strategies, how have they evolved over time. So we thought that's a good niche to focus our attention on, particularly considering our interest on institutional changes and a reconfiguration of resources. So in that sense, it's a unique case study. We adopted a longitudinal perspective, looking through 20, 25 years of the formation of the firm and how it evolved over time, and how, and more importantly, how it interacted with the structural changes that were happening due to the institutional changes in the higher education sector. So primarily what we did, our data collection was with very key informants, individuals who had been part of this private educational institution for a much longer period of time, and people who joined as academic members of staff, who operationalized the business schools, and going further, the business school evolved into a full-fledged university more recently. So for us, it gave us a clear picture of the trajectory of the business school, how it evolved. So from that point of view, we also checked and focused attention on the institutional changes that has happened in the Indian higher education sector. Our starting point was the educational policy of 1986, which we thought created the first grounds. Thanks, Surinder. Go back. Yeah, thanks. Which created the first grounds for private players to play a bigger role in the higher education sector, which created, moved away higher education from merits to non-merit status, created opportunities for privatization to a certain extent. And over a period of time, what we also observed was there are a few amendments that were made to the higher education policies. And for us, that provided the larger context where the changes were happening. And Surinder, if you go back to the next slide, then we can provide. And this is the case of this specific business group, specific higher education institution group, which we called a SPUT group, a private educational trust group. It essentially evolved at the very beginning as a family firm involved in trading of commodities and non-commodities in Rajasthan, in Haryana, sorry. And then in the process, like any other trading groups, it accumulated land as a critical resource. I think they also moved into real estate at some point, but they explored the opportunities that were presented to them in the beginning of 1990s with the liberalization of the economy. And that's where they decided to move into establishing a school for nursery and primary students, primary children, because that's where their own children were in that stage. So that is a personal story as much as it's a strategy in a sense. And from there, it evolved from establishing a school, consolidating their presence in the schooling sector. They became a bigger name in and around Delhi particularly. And much later, what we observed was much later in around mid 2000, they moved into establishing a business school. I mean, in a sense, they followed what others were doing, but others moved into from schooling to higher education sometimes around mid 1990s. Whereas with these guys, they waited. They were not very sure that they would like to go that path, but having seen others doing it, at some point they decided that's also an interesting path to move. So in a sense, the mid 2000, they established this particular business school, but the challenges were, how do you bring on board very experienced academic members of staff? Because you can have a school, but to establish a business school, you have to legitimize it. So they used they were able to get attention of some very senior academics in and around Delhi, and that's how the business school emerged. However, again, adapting to those changes, the institutional changes, they decided that they should have strategic partnerships with foreign players. Again, a strategy that many business schools, private business schools in India have adopted, and that's actually our focus of larger research of how exactly these business schools have legitimized themselves, and they have used international strategic partnerships as a mechanism to achieve legitimization, which is what they did. However, they went a bit further. I think they more or less followed the approach that others have done, which is primarily adopting a franchisee model of working, providing degrees of foreign universities, which they did. But again, there was changes in the higher education regulatory systems, which ensured that, and which actually led to the failure of the foreign university bill. So the point here is they were making those strategies, and yet there are significant changes that were happening at the regulatory front, and there was a constant tension to adapt. So that provided us the context to look into some of the changes that happened and some of the adaptation that they made. So what are the key findings we find here? One is, of course, it is very clear that the Indian higher education sector have undergone significant institutional changes. Most of the institutional changes have been regulatory by nature. And that is, as a consequence, there is the dance between the incumbent firms and the state who would exercise what deal of control. And in specific case of business schools, the institutional changes we thought presented significant opportunities to private, PET group to adapt to those changes and also expand their own operations, because they moved from being a trading company dealing with basic commodities to establishing a school, consolidating that business, moving into business school, and then forming an university. So in a sense, notwithstanding the regulatory changes, that also presented them significant opportunities to evolve and to grow. And they were able to do that. So institutional challenges that results from institutional ambiguity in relation to what institutional entities does, And what are their powers? As we said earlier, that's a constant dance. Nonetheless, it made it much easier for provider of education at primary and secondary schools to expand. So that's broadly a finding that we arrived at. However, when we started to drill a bit more, we asked ourselves, how did they really manage to do this? Because why couldn't others do this? And what we found interesting was, and this is where we went back to the literature, because we adopted adaptive approach of abductive approach of research and analysis. So we're going back and forth with the data and the literature. We found that primarily the land and building, the physical infrastructure gave them quite a, it allowed them to make those transitions. That was significant because within resource-based PUs, land and physical infrastructure is not treated as, not considered as idiosyncratic. Rather, these are tradable commodities which can be, which lacks either VIRO attributes and others. So they don't lead to competitive advantage per se. However, what we also further understood and as we analyzed was that the institutional changes creates significant implications on how value is perceived and derived of resources such as land and physical infrastructures. So resources what might deemed wasteful at a point of time would actually become much more useful and different. And particularly land bank is a classic case. When the cities emerge, when the cities expand, land bank value also goes up. At the same time, beyond that Barnian points of where land exists, what the value is attributed, we also found the significant role of Penrosian dimensions, that the social actors, the founders, the owners, the senior managers, they are very critical players, not because they take strategic decisions, but more because of their capacity to sense the change, seize those opportunities, reconfigure those resources that they have, which might not have significant value at a point in time. So from that point of view, the social actors are much more critical players. Broadly speaking, what we also conclude was turbulence in the environment could be really a good context for managerial learning, in the sense that it allows managers to reconfigure their resources, but more importantly, it allows them to reassess their own presence, the reassess of the firm in the context of the changes that's happening around them. So broadly, this is how we looked at this particular case. And as we discussed earlier, went back and forth with the literature on resource-based view and institutional change to make sense of some of the strategic choices, strategic decisions that the founders were making us to adapt to this changing environment that they found themselves in. I think we are pretty much on time. Thank you.
You're muted, Professor Kundu.
Thank you, Ketu. So since we are running short on time, so I'm going to move to the second presentation. And then we'll take the questions at the end. So thank you for a delightful presentation. I'm sure there will be some questions from the audience. On to the second paper.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. So this is a paper, and keeping in mind the time that we have, I will not go into a lot of details. The paper is published. All of you can read at leisure, but Subrata and I will provide the main storyline here, and it's written by the four authors that are here on the first slide here. So this is moving away from more of the macro level institutions, and we're looking at the bottom of the pyramid, the firms, and the end use, the largest socioeconomic group on the planet is the bottom of the pyramid, and how firms that are serving this group look at the causal configurations of being cost effective by making concomitant changes to their business model. So without any further delay, I'll just, so can you please go to the next slide? Okay, I think this is Basu, you'd like to add something?
Sure. Thanks, Ashish. So this paper has an antecedent as well as going forward, there is a future to this paper. So there are two ways of looking into this paper. One was from the entrepreneurship stream in the emerging markets. It started with our focus on social entrepreneurship, social enterprises. And then we started looking into a hardcore bottom of the pyramid, where we did a little bit of a qualitative analysis. And from there, we proceeded into this current paper. So where we looked into the weak enforcement mechanisms which are rampant and prevalent in the emerging markets, and how firms which are operating in the bottom of the pyramid, especially the EMNCs, so how they are creating and capturing values. And from there onwards, so this is what this current paper is. And then this links to the question of entrepreneurial firms adapting to uncertainties, those uncertainties being exacerbated by weak institutions in the emerging markets. So which is the next paper. Now, from the perspective of thematic perspective, Surinder, can you just go back to the from thematic perspective, this is again, hardcore BOP specific research. There is the second paper is what we are looking into, and then there is a third paper also which is in the pipeline, but we'll deal with that subsequently. So, given that this is a focus on bottom of the pyramid and how firms are essentially creating values, and what are the causal configurations which leads to those creation of values. So this is more of a methodology paper, and the reason why it's strong in methodology, or the focus was on methodology, is the data which is not very forthcoming. Please go to the next slide. Yeah. I'll just before I hand it over to Ashish. So this where he will be looking into this, he'll be explaining this in greater detail. There are methodological challenges in doing research on bottom of pyramid, because most of the published works are from cases, and hardcore data is not available. So that posed a challenge in terms of addressing this. And therefore, may I request Ashish to explain these things for the next two.
Yeah, thank you, Shriprata. So as we just set the scene on the importance of the BOP context, and the diversity in the research at the moment led us to further explorations. The whole concept of pluriversality highlights that, we've got single case descriptions of what's happening, to practitioner-oriented prescriptive approaches, description at one end, prescription at the other, to even cases that have looked at historical legacies and colonial exploitation leading to BOP misfortune. Or to some extent, we have literature that is focused on multiple case study reviews. So given this diversity in understanding, there is a general need for a more systematic review to advance the field. And there's a lack of robust theorization of the bottom of pyramid. So one of the ways this literature has been approached is to look at transaction costs when they're high, and when the institutional voids are present, that creates enough challenges for the BOP players. So we focus on the problem of testing, and given the lack of data based on accounting-based measures only, we then look at cases from the Harvard Business School publishing collection that have a priori motivation and very well developed and curated representations of the BOP phenomena. And like most scholars, like us people, who research and publish cases out of our research, that is a fertile area to go to. Now, as Shubha mentioned, we're looking at the issue of costs and transaction costs, and bringing in the concept of business model and business model innovation, where the core functions are, what are the ways in which these BOP firms create value, and once the value is created, how do they capture that value? And if we can unbundle the associated cost and the value creation and value capture mechanisms from this vast pool of cases that we will look at, we could then, unbundle the specific, variables that come out strong. So to summarize, this figure sort of captures. So to ensure the entrepreneurial sustenance of firms at the bottom of the pyramid, you must understand what are the value creation and value capture drivers are, and collectively, the causal configuration, the governance configuration to mitigate the different types of transaction cost. So if we know what these costs are and if we know what the drivers are, we then step forward to develop an analytical framework, which comprises of delineating the transaction cost, which we define as information searching cost, bargaining and contracting cost, monitoring and enforcement cost. This is largely within the transaction cost theory parameter. So more details, if you want, are there in the paper. But again, for entrepreneurial sustenance, we really need to ensure, when I say we, the BOP firm needs to ensure that the value creation and value capture elements are working in its favor. Finally, to measure them and operationalize them, we then code them as value capture, total value creation and value capture. So in the next slide, please. So in terms of what we did, so we employed the case study method. And since, as I mentioned, the Harvard Business Case Studies are a very rich resource, irrespective of the fact that sometimes they've been criticized as very stylized representation of reality. But nevertheless, we still believe that it's a very reliable data tool. It has a lot of structured presentation and it provides rich context-specific information. And the description of a lot of process level activities have been undertaken. And we also get additional insights of this by looking at the teaching notes, etc. So there is a rich level of data that is available to be analyzed. So what we did was we looked at the following keywords: bottom of the pyramid, BOP strategies, emerging market, poverty elevation in the HBS database. And then the first cull delivered about 103 cases as of June 2018. And then we started to include and exclude based on our criteria, which was the case inclusion criteria was private enterprises operating at BOP, public-private partnership-based public enterprises, or public-private partnership projects. And we included both for-profit as well as not-for-profit or philanthropic, charitable, social enterprises there in that. But we definitely excluded only pure government organizations for a simple reason, they have a different objective to deal with. Next slide. In terms of what went next, so after the final number of cases were finalized, we then undertook a content analysis, and we kind of administered a closed-ended questionnaire on 3 broad areas, looking at transactional cost, the governance configuration, and value creation and value capture, or absence of it, in each of these 42 cases from the 103 that we initially sampled. And the questionnaire was self-administered via exhaustive purposive content analysis. The details of how we did it are there in the paper. Next slide. So then what we had was self-administered questionnaire yielded key activities and key deliverables. And this is in line with the literature on business model innovation and business model, where we look at activity-based attributes and value capture and value creation in both the products and services, but also then linking that back to the literature on transaction cost economics. So here's a sample of how we started, coding each case, providing the descriptors first, and then the analysis that followed. Next slide, please. So once the basic categorization was done, we identified the construct causing the relative changes in the value creation and value capture, and how it was linked to the corresponding reduction in transaction costs. And as I mentioned earlier, in the transaction costs literature, the theory part, we looked at these 4 different types of cost: information searching cost, cost of bargaining and contracting, cost of monitoring, cost of enforcement, and then of course the value creation and value capture aspects. So the content analysis was very meticulously done, and then we extracted themes that fitted these descriptors, and then they were coded accordingly. And I think at this point, I would invite Shubha Brother to take you through the FSCQA part. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. So effectively, the reason why this paper we thought was interesting is, one, we use the case survey method. So whereby what Ashish mentioned, we had an a priori framework. It's sort of a questionnaire which we self-administered. Now the issue is, you can still identify, you can operationalize value capture and value creation. In short, value capture is, the value creation is the what question, and value capture is, how you are essentially delivering it. So these two things are measurable. But then when we are looking into the governance part, so governance is a process, it's a mechanism, it's very difficult to identify. So we did a proxy in terms of how are these governance mechanisms reducing certain specific types of transaction costs. It's like the antibody antigen story. So there is a specific transaction cost, and it is being captured by a specific governance mechanism in terms of its reduction. So once this was clear, so what we did was we identified these are the transaction cost elements, and this is what is being done. So once that is there, then we put that as value creation, value capture being the dependent variables. Then information searching cost, bargaining and contracting cost, monitoring or enforcement cost. So we started coding them as if there is a governance mechanism which controls for or reduces the information searching cost, then there is one. And otherwise, if it's not there, then it becomes 0. So this is the way we completely made the table. We created the table. It was basically we culled down from 103 to 42 cases. So that's where everything was there. So Surinder, the next slide, please. So then we ran the classic FSQCA, fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. What we did was we also brought in more insights in terms of for-profit, not for-profit, then pure emerging market cases. And there are examples in the data set where there are people, especially the illegal immigrants, who are also being addressed by institutions within those countries, for example, Romania. So those are developed countries, but then there are BOP populations also there. So we had a 2x2 matrix there. So then we found out all these, these are prime implicants. And then we also looked into those configurations which have the highest consistency and coverage in terms of these are the number of cases which are there. So we found out those dominant configurations which are emerging. So in the next slide, please. So more or less, this is what the final table looks like. So we had 2 types of tables, one for value capture, the other one was for value creation. So next one, next to next one. In fact, there are 2 such things. So these are the key findings which we figured out. And I think Ashish, you can black headings. It's yours.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Thanks. So what we found out was bottom of pyramid firms tended to externalize some of their activities and associated costs to the BOP entities who were hierarchically unrelated to the M&E. We also found that these firms developed deep insights of the what and the how, so both value creation and value capture, as well as what and where to relax. So again, the context plays a very important role here, and having that understanding of that rich context through the case allowed this without triggering the behavioral opportunism from either of the transacting parties. We also noted that the commercial ventures stopped short of the enforcement-related mechanisms, while social enterprises practice enforcement, which is counterintuitive and at the events to the literature. So this is another interesting finding in the study. And commercial ventures focus on a priori information collection and engage in monitoring, whereas the socially oriented enterprises, they don't appear to be much innovative by the way of how they obtain the critical inputs through the product design or service design. So these configurations with higher consistency show emphasis of ex post in containing ex post costs. And finally, in general, the governance mechanisms towards value capture showed higher consistency and coverage than value creation. And this is in line, what we see in the literature on product lifecycle logic, where products are developed in Western countries and gravitate towards, underdeveloped markets towards the end of the life cycle in the developed countries. And the BOP-centric mechanism, M&Es were more focused on identifying the delivery logistics and centric governance, so that they stay connected to such markets rather than value creation or business philanthropy of enforcing compliances. So finally then, in conclusion, the contribution, we contribute to the literature on transaction cost economics by identifying the transactional impediments in the large and the growing sector of the BOP market. Here, specifically, what we find is that firms, those who face impediments and respond via products and processes changes, so basically innovating that. And consequently, by observing the novelty in either their process or product, we can then triangulate and extrapolate how and where these firms have innovated to overcome the transaction cost issues. So I think that is in itself a very significant contribution. The second, we uncover the different cost reduction configurations adopted by these firms. So 42, for some it might be a small number, but it is still quite a compelling set of cases that we have. And this allowed us to understand how firms innovate and overcome the transaction cost. And given the high transaction costs that do exist in BOP markets, particularly from those who are setting up their base there, appropriate governance mechanisms are very important for them to continue to innovate. And these governance mechanisms can help mitigate the behavioral uncertainties that are identified in the TCE literature. So overall, the configurations of different transaction costs incurred by firms helps reduce behavioral risk to transactional impediments. And finally, without saying, there's the methodological contribution here, applying the FSCQA and multi-case comparative method to unearth the causal configuration within those constraints.
So let me just supplement what Ashish has said. So one, apart from the methodological part, what we already know about BOP is there is transaction cost. So everybody takes it for granted. But what is exactly the nature of transaction cost? We couldn't find actually in the literature. In fact, in terms of the literature review, we wouldn't find it. So therefore, we also decided that let's first find out the exact nature of transaction cost and the governance mechanism which controls for those transaction costs. So therefore, we provided those governance mechanisms and their configurations to control the transaction cost and therefore create values. So in our from our perspective, this is more into the Williamson's perception or Williamson's stream of governance mechanism, how they can reduce it. And if these every firm will have its own governance mechanisms. So those are specific to the firm. But overall, if you get a framework that these are the things which needs to be targeted and therefore addressing them will enable a proper entry into the BOP, and the BOP is no longer a dark thing out there. So it's not something to be afraid of. Then I think we can really contribute both in terms of academia as well as from the perspective from the practitioner's perspective. So these were this is the IBR paper on the BOP, and this leads to the next one, which is the entrepreneurial adaptation paper. And of course, the four authors, the co-authors are there. So yours truly, Suridhar, Professor Pawan Budhwar, and Pradeep Mishra, they are there. And this is an exceedingly interesting paper because for the first time, we tried to marry two divergent thought processes. Sundar, can you please go to the next one? So if you look into the key snapshot, in a snapshot, what are the key things? So the reason why entrepreneurial adaptation is interesting, because the literature on entrepreneurship predominantly looks into opportunity identity. In fact, strategic entrepreneurship, as HIT and others have clearly stated. So strategy is all about, entrepreneurship is all about opportunity identification, right? Whereas strategy is all about advantage seeking behavior. So strategic entrepreneurship would be ideally trying to marry both of these together, but then there is a problem. So entrepreneurship, looking into entrepreneurship literature, we have this opportunity identification, which leads to the entrepreneurial venture creation. But then there is a huge gap whereby then the entrepreneurial scaling up problem comes into the picture. And then the literature is full of at least 4 or 5 broad themes, which leads to the problem of scaling up. So what was missing inside, in fact, one of the reasons why about 85% of the ventures in US fail, and in India it's around 95%, is the question of the success or failure of adaptation. So this is something which is there. This was a gap which was already there, but we couldn't really focus on that. And because there are, again, ways of, there are measurement problems. So how do you really first create a concept of entrepreneurial adaptation, establish that to be true, and then measure it? So this paper, in that sense, is that the clear positioning this void, addressing that void, and then measuring or operationalizing that void. So the next one, please. So the this is the interesting part about this entrepreneurial adaptation. Typically, entrepreneurship is associated with agile opportunity seeking, aggressive opportunity. So it's all about running fast, the cheetah, so to say, or the rabbit. Whereas adaptation is a time-consuming, laid-back phenomena. So it's derived from evolutionary theory. So it's the tortoise. So therefore, entrepreneurial adaptation is antagonistic. They don't gel together. Then the question is, adaptation is more amenable in the context of large firms, and therefore, what exactly is the nature of entrepreneurial adaptation? That's where we have defined this, and I would request Surinder to take it over. No, I think it's Ketu's part. Yeah, Shirkat, please.
Yeah, hi. Back again. I think here in this particular paper, what the authors have used three different constructs. Two constructs building up from entrepreneurial adaptation, the strategic choices and adaptive capabilities. Entrepreneurial adaptation is primarily a mechanism, is how they have conceptualized, that imparts entrepreneurial organizations with some cognitive, analytical abilities, which allows those firms to foresee long-term opportunities and emerging opportunities. In a sense, sensing capacity, which allows them assessing the market changes. It also allows them to develop decision-making abilities in terms of the strategic choices that they can make in the context of the emerging opportunities that might arise. And the third is creating a very proactive action orientation of adaptive capabilities. In a sense, when in entrepreneurial adaptations, in entrepreneurial firms, entrepreneurs more or less are not only able to foresee the future or foresee the changes in the marketplace, but also create strategic changes, not the strategic decisions, of course, but strategic changes within the firm, and create conditions that it can adapt when the change really materialize. In a sense, the two constructs that entrepreneurial adaptation literature really builds on is the strategic choice, entrepreneurial strategic choice, which looks into three broad dimensions: the futurity, the analysis, and proactiveness. And it, in a sense, reflects the firm's cognitive considerations towards long-term orientation, more or less comprehensive decision-making, ensuring that there is consistency in the processes that they have within the firm and the choices that they're making in the process. Broadly, it is an entrepreneurial construct, more or less, creates conditions for novel capabilities and so on and so forth. In contrast, adaptive capability, in a sense, also allows firms to develop the ability to identify and capitalize opportunities that emerge from the market. So again, it's a more sensing capacity, to what extent we can sense what's happening. Building from exploration and exploitation strategy, leading to rather, but primarily it leads to adaptation and evolution of firms. And to do that, broadly adaptive capabilities and strategic entrepreneurial choices go hand in hand. Of course, they are two distinct constructs, but they also overlap. So we cannot really see them as one ignoring the other, but we have to see them in conjunction. So in the way, go to the next slide. Yeah, so broadly, the paper also arrives at this particular conceptual model wherein entrepreneurial adaptation builds those two constructs: strategic entrepreneurial choices, being proactive, being analytical, futurity, and adaptive capabilities, which is primarily on technology-related, organizational processes, and procedure-related, adaptive capabilities in terms of the market changes and non-market changes. And that leads to that leads to entrepreneurial adaptation, a sustained entrepreneurial adaptation, when particularly in conditions, in contexts which Subrata mentioned earlier, where there is resource constraints and a high degree of failure is possible. Next slide, Surendra. So the context again is the same, is when institutions that support entrepreneurial ecosystems are absent or not well developed. The authors argue that the probability of failed ventures are higher. I think that's the examples Subrata gave earlier. So higher incidence of venture failure might discourage budding entrepreneurs from taking risk at all and in greener pastures. And therefore, in that particular context, the entrepreneurial adaptation might provide the necessary template, a framework to hedge against the risk of failure. So this is the broadly the context and the thought process that underpins this particular paper. Thank you. So in the next slide, I think that's yours, Surinder, I guess.
Yeah. So I think now maybe some of you might have already been starting to think about, okay, so what is the difference between the entrepreneurial mindset and the entrepreneurial adaptation? Because in the literature, there is a wide explanation about the entrepreneurial mindset, which is essentially in the context of the entrepreneurship in more advanced or developed countries where you have a lot of resources available to entrepreneur, unlike in emerging market where there's a lot of resource constraints. If you think about the extant literature, you also see that they talk about, for example, Ireland and colleagues talk about the availability of opportunity register. So there is a register and the entrepreneur could actually choose which opportunity to exploit and not to exploit and so on. Unlike in emerging market, the situations are much more different. Here, the firms will have to probably think about what limited resources do they have and how to best use them in order to develop some of the capabilities that they need to have beforehand. They go on to take over their competitors in terms of taking risk, in terms of taking proactively taking price wars and so on. So there's a bit of a difference, and some of these things with regard to the adaptation do find their origin within the extant literature on dynamic capabilities, which talks about different types of capabilities in terms of the innovation capabilities, in terms of the adaptive capabilities, and so on. So if we think about the adaptive capabilities generally, which these entrepreneurs tend to develop as a part of their entrepreneurial adaptation process, there are at least 4 types that the literature talks about. One is about the technology-related adaptive capabilities, organizational-related adaptive capabilities in order to make changes within the organization, vis-a-vis the institutional changes that are being taking place. With regard to the market-related, obviously that means looking at the external changes in the market, and more importantly, the non-market adapted capabilities, which you all understand from non-market strategy literature, which talks about bridging and buffering strategies, what firms do in order to protect them, or in order to get the patronage from the political actors, which could provide them support which they need in order to survive, first of all, to move on to the next level of entrepreneurship, which we talks about as if these are the hard steps for undertaking entrepreneurship. So initially, they do things looking at the futurity, looking at the other dimensions, which leads to the adaptive capabilities. So these are the choices that they make, and that would lead to some of these adaptive capabilities that the firms would evolve. Probably I will quickly, would not read, this is all there in the paper, basic definitions of all these strategic choices. They all emerge from the Venkat Raman's seminal work on strategic orientation. So what is aggressiveness, what is analysis, defensiveness, futurity, proactiveness? Briefly, I would simply say that the firms would pay more attention towards proactiveness, futurity, and analysis rather than focusing on aggressiveness and the defensiveness. There are much more detailed explanations in the paper, which probably we can't talk at this point in time because of the lack of time. There were hypotheses that were being then framed on the basis of what we perceive will lead to the firm performance. So first of all, the analysis, futurity, and proactiveness will be the choices which these firms will make in order to first develop the adaptive capabilities, and then the adaptive capabilities that would emerge out of these strategic choices would lead to the firm's growth in terms of profitability, in terms of the growth per se, and then the idea is to show that these adaptive capabilities mediate the relationship between the choices and the performance aspects of the firm in terms of the profit and in terms of the growth. So I would now hand over to Professor Basu for taking over with the results and discussion.
Thanks, Surinder. So very briefly, we have about, we started with about 2,000 responses. Then that was the data set actually. Then we actually received 311 responses from there, cleaning up everything. The usable one was around 209. These are all firm level data. So we did, we did really brainstorm a whole lot of things in terms of whether it's a formative construct, it should be a formative construct or a reflective construct. Those things were all there. And then just to ensure that our research is as much robust as possible, we used partially squared structural equations. Then we predominantly in this paper we ended up using the multiple mediator model, which is the process model of Pritchard and Hayes, and we supplement that also with the seemingly unrelated regression. So having done that, we found that predominantly here, as it is, you can see. So this is in terms of both growth and profitability. These are the two measurement terms for performances. We found that for growth, firms' performance as growth, it was the organizational related adaptive capabilities and the non-market strategies, so non-market capabilities. So they are the primary contributors. Whereas for the profitability part, so again, it's predominantly the non-market strategies which leads to the profitability of entrepreneurial firms in terms of their adaptation. So this was, in a sense, it was a little bit, novel in the sense. What we expected was, yeah, technology will not lead to performance because in most cases, emerging markets, they don't, emerging market firms, they really don't look into, they don't invest in R&D, therefore the contribution from technology will not be there. Though in this research, we found there are these choices leads to technology, but to that extent, maybe it's not sufficient, it's not optimal in terms of leading to a innovative new product or service, and therefore the performance parameters then so on. Marketing related activities is something which we expected that should come. What we found out that it's not a great contributor, maybe because of presence of non-market capabilities that got suppressed. But there are reasons for that also. So all in all, what we found out that in emerging market, as per expectation, it's the non-market strategies which holds good, which are major contributors to the adaptation process. In other words, you need to make the people happy in terms of their expectation, and also need to be in good terms with the political bureaucratic nexus, which holds good. And there are evidences both from emerging markets, India as well as China. I would request Professor Malik to take over in terms of the takeaways. These are, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Basu. So overall, from an emerging market context, sustained entrepreneurship does not follow the Big Bang theory, but the rather slow and steady approach is evident in emerging markets. And the idea is they proactively build on adaptive capabilities for sustainability, which helps us conceptualize the entrepreneurial adaptation. Second, the content and the configuration of EA reveals the process of cognition and considerations that drives action. I think that part is also very well established in the extant literature. SEC is the brain, while AC represents the brawn of the entrepreneurial adaptation process. And that, I think, is a very neat summarization of what the research found. The cognitive considerations or strategic choices, they converge on dimensions of, as mentioned earlier, futurity analysis and proactiveness, and contribute towards the firm's capabilities to adapt. What is interesting here is, in contrast, I'm just mindful of time, the futurity and analysis are less resource intensive and involve armchair predictive modeling and or the boardroom discussions. To the exclusion, this is to the exclusion of aggressive defensiveness and riskiness, which are more resource intensive strategic postures involving rapid market expansion and product market growth. The third takeaway here is that most emerging markets, deregulation is a continuous process. It removes the entry barriers, exposing local entrepreneurs to competition from financially strong corporations who have a portfolio of popular and innovative products. So against all these odds, these local firms can prioritize which capabilities to build, which political bureaucratic nexus to tap into, and then which industries to be in that are regulated, that are deregulated. And so societal changes that influences the influencing consumption needs to be the influencing consumptions and social expectation needs. So overall, EM firms need to gain critical information and exploit the sectoral diversification-based growth that is presented by the institutional context in which they're operating. Next slide, please. Okay. So some further takeaways from the other papers. So firms in emerging markets recognize the concerted efforts and initiatives made by local agencies to bring BOP markets within the mainstream organized economy. This can be undertaken by initiating internally consistent reconfiguration, as we saw in the earlier paper, leading to creating necessary distribution channels that can access those markets effectively. Additionally, or alternatively, emerging market firms may complement the state's initiatives in these markets via public-private partnerships. Either ways, firms need to proactively, build on organization-related AC to venture out and exploit these emerging growth opportunities. So here's the blending of the findings and framing the broad future agenda. We try to say how adaptive capabilities play a critical role in tapping into the growth opportunities. And we also found that, in the papers, that the strategic nature of the entrepreneurial choices in the adaptation process, assuming the existence of less lucrative VOP markets, we find that entrepreneurial choices are most significantly direct towards efforts building at MSC, followed by NMSC. However, MSC do not significantly contribute to profitability and growth, while non-market adaptive capabilities significantly contribute to growth. So there are some important takeaways here. Overall, we believe that this will be an outcome of strategic cognition process involving carefully calibrated long-term considerations that highlight the future scenario and also takes into account the political bureaucratic influences progressively. So this is the adaptation process to give way to the market forces in a fully deregulated economy. So therefore, the focus on non-market adaptive capability is similar to holding the fort, stay put, while towards the organizational and market-related adaptive capability tantamount is to forming and reinforcing the ranks and files. So that, I think, is to some degree self-explanatory there. So there are, nevertheless, like with any research, several limitations and some future directions that we've found out. So largely, we've used quantitative analysis and cross-sectional data to capture the mechanisms of entrepreneurial adaptation, wherein we define adaptation as an outcome of longer-term evolutionary process. However, we believe that more work is needed in terms of understanding the causal relationships, which may not necessarily be easily unbundled through a quantitative design. So more qualitative research, perhaps more longitudinal, intense fieldwork type activity might be more in order. Secondly, we believe that related to the issue of adaptation, although we did not investigate how capabilities accumulate incrementally over a period of time, but we focused on the necessary antecedent conditions and choices that are exercised by entrepreneurial firms that lead to the creation of adaptive capabilities as an outcome. So again, there's more work needed here. Thirdly, in our sample, which comes from largely India, which is a very large emerging market, but our findings are not easily generalizable to other emerging markets, such as Brazil, Mexico, where although there might be similar degree of resource paucity and institutional uncertainty, the institutional changes are dynamic, given that there's a lot of liberalization that is happening in these contexts. Finally, we did not separately include the resource paucity and institutional uncertainties within our models, as these concepts are inseparable and they are embedded in the context. So our findings do not allow us for estimation of the macroeconomic institutional variables, as these would uniformly apply to all firms. So further modeling and environmental condition can improve and validate our theorization going forward. So I think that is it from us lot. So thank you patiently for bearing with us and listening to our rather dense and for us exciting papers. Over to Professor Kundu.
Thank you, Ashish. What a delightful, presentations for 3 excellent papers, and I hope the audience got to see that, how do you write a good research paper? Because at the end of the day, these 3 papers has been published in good journals, and it's a very timely topic. Entrepreneurial adaptation in emerging markets is a very timely topic. The conversation and dialogue will continue, I'm sure, in the next conference, next meeting. And, obviously, we are trying to extend the frontiers of knowledge. So one, because of timing issues, I know we are 11 minutes past our scheduled time. So obviously, I would like to open up for a few minutes, if Professor Rajesh allows me, for the audience to participate. It's very important to get their perspective. So if the audience has any questions for the distinguished panelists, this is the time to engage. And of course, you can write to them individually. You can read their papers. Their papers has been published in premier journals. But this is an opportunity for you to let your views heard to the panelists. So audience, please let us know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, sir. This is Sandeep. Sir, my question is related to the first paper, when we were talking about that given the firms are having various kind of resources and capabilities, and then how they are actually adapting or actually getting their self ready for the institutional changes. There we were actually talking about that institutional changes are taking place, and then the firms are actually adapting. What are your views when we look at the firm institutional response from the other way, that is a way of getting strategic legitimacy, when the firms are actually taking the bottom up approach, when they are saying that even if we took the take the example of the educational institutes, in spite of looking at that there were some policy implementation, because of that they have to adopt their path of growth. But if you look at the demand side as well, because because of the change in the economy, the demands were also changing. So because of that, they have to anticipate it earlier, and then they have to grow.
I think that's a very valid point, Sandeep. Thanks for the very interesting question. I think that's precisely what we found as well in our own data as well. I think the critical point here is what the last presentation really talks about is a political bureaucratic nexus, right? And when we talk about the institutional changes, and when we talk about this founding members, social actors sensing those changes, they're primarily sensing those changes, which is regulatory. And by building relationships with those who are part and parcel of that political, bureaucratic nexus, that allows them that little bit more time to reflect and say, okay, this is the direction things are going, and how could we quickly adapt so that we legitimize ourselves as the change happens. So it's a constant process, right? And I think again, the last paper's first takeaway is, some of these adaptations are process questions, right? How exactly that really happens in practice. So in a sense, broadly speaking, yes, this is also something we observed. That is also our case study also highlights.
So there is a question in the chat by Kiran. She's asking, adding to what Sandeep just asked, can a study of workaround practices be a good starting point, especially considering severe institutional voids in emerging markets? So I think I would briefly say on this, and then I would pass it on to my colleagues to talk about this. So increasingly, I'm mainly a very quantitative researcher, but increasingly I have been drawn into qualitative research, and more specifically on case study research. And what I have personally found, some of these case studies are quite rich, and they could be actually a very good starting point to study any phenomenon that you are interested in studying. Because a lot of these things, that the rich insights that you can get, in fact, also looking at the problematization. What exactly is the problem? Looking at some of those issues, a case study is essentially a very good starting point. It doesn't matter whether the context that you're studying is too big. It doesn't mean that the case study has to be only for a very small problem, which may be very localized to one individual firm. And if that is the case, then you will not be able to build anything special out of that case study. Case studies needs to be used as a way of theory building, as a way of generalization. And I think the idea here is to look at one individual case, or maybe comparative cases, or multiple cases, depending upon which way you take this. The idea is to look at some of these issues in depth, looking at some of these causal relationship in depth from the sources itself, and then try to look at the logics and theorize.
Any other questions for the audience? So one comment which I had for the panel is, as you were presenting, I was reflecting upon, of course, the theme was on entrepreneurial adaptation. And yet, I was thinking that, business models do change, right? I mean, if you look at traditionally any firm, they start with a cost leadership, type of, business model, and then they go to a differentiation model, a product differentiation, different strategy. So I was reflecting upon that, given the fact that the institutional voids is also changing, institutions do change, right, with time. And so on the part of the entrepreneur, the strategic ability to maneuver and to change the business model is equally important, because it has to be in tandem with the change in the environment. And yet, I was very curious to get a perspective from the panelists, that how do the entrepreneurs decide that when is a good time to move away from the so-called starting point of the business model to something different, because competitors are doing that, and so you have to keep up or match with the the actors out there. And so how do you basically, decide on that set of course of action, for Indian entrepreneurs, to decide that, well, we have to rethink our business model. And of course, it is tied to the issue of adaptation too, right? It cannot be, me too approach, you have to be proactive, you have to be creative, you have to be innovative, you have to think outside the box, all those things. So any thoughts from the panelists in terms of what is your thoughts in terms of this business model, innovation/adaptation?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Professor Kundu. I've done some work, on a related theme. So at one end, you want to understand what is the current institutional makeup. Is it more restrictive? Is it more expansive? Does it impose more constraints? And given, there are always going to be some constraints. So one way to think about it is, what is the degree of leeway and choice do entrepreneurs have in a given institutional environment? Now, that is only one part of the story. The second part of the story depends on the entrepreneur themselves, in the sense that the degree of personal agency that the entrepreneur exercises, which can again be broken down into three possible choices. So you either have a status quo, you put your head in the sand like an ostrich and do nothing, or you come out and try and carve out an innovative solution. And the third is the deviant agency. So we have these triarchy, a deviant fit, a conformist fit, and an innovative fit to the institutional environment. Now that, I believe, that exercising of that personal agentic resource is really vital for entrepreneurs to, one, enable the choices in relation to the environment, and then going forward then. Over to my other colleagues. If someone back.
Okay, so I would just try to add something to what Ashish has already said. So Professor Kundu was trying to, if I understood the question properly, there are these two generic strategies, and therefore how or when should the entrepreneur understand to initiate the switch, right? So here, if you look into the strategic choices, the three critical traits, though Venkatraman speaks about postures, I would say it's sort of a trait, is that of futurity, analysis, and proactiveness. Now, if you're talking about futurity, you can actually predict, you can see how things are going to move, how things are going to pan out, how they should evolve. Now, if you're talking about proactiveness, that fits with the question of given this is the direction in which the environment is likely to, or the competition is likely to pan out, this would be my steps. And therefore, the steps that I'm thinking of, that would operationalize in terms of the capabilities which I'm going to look into. Whether should I be focusing more on technology, and therefore technology-driven differentiation is what we are going to look into, or should I be looking more into the organizational restructuring, and therefore fit into the cost-cutting mode, and therefore the cost leadership strategies, that's what we are going to look into. Or for that purpose, should there be a marketing-based differentiation that would lead to this? And the non-market strategies predominantly doesn't fit into the Porterian framework of generic strategies, because that's supposed to be common to everybody. But here we found that this is the predominant form which drives the the performances, both in terms of growth and profitability. Now, having said that, we Surinder and I, we had been debating on this topic, that can there be a sequence in terms of these the postures? Should analysis come first, should futurity come first, or should proactiveness come first? So if there is a sequence in this, that may itself lead to a rehashing, reorientation, reprioritization of the capabilities. So that itself, and this is possible in terms of the cross-sectional data. It's not a problem in terms of that whether it's a cross-section and therefore we should go for a longitudinal data or not. It's not required. So once this is, because factor analysis itself will reveal these things. So once we can do this, so that was what we looked into. Going forward, that this is what we'll do. So one will look into a sequencing in terms of these the choices, and therefore how they would be affecting. In fact, this would lead to different types of capabilities, different types of prioritization of the capabilities which may come up, and therefore they may affect the performances, different types of performances, whether it should be a growth-oriented, top-line driven performance, or it's a profitability driven performance. That's that may be a way forward. Over to Shwet, Ketu and Surinder.
Professor Kundu, we actually highlighted this in our paper here, specifically how they moved from one business model to another business model and what led them to go to the other business model. This particular case was, primarily it was a school. It evolved into a, primary school to secondary school. And the challenge for them was, in our educational system, the class 12th results come in July, or June, July, August, around the same time. So the question for them was, what do we do with these students? Because, that the demographic that they were catering to was essentially children of bureaucrats, children of business people, children of politicians, the neo-rich in a sense. So what do these guys do? They cannot go to foreign universities to study, right? Because the foreign universities, the semester starts in June, July, it's when the results come. So for them, they said, okay, these students are going to further their education in January, February. So why not we become the university? So we retain the same students, they stay with us, and yet we can provide them a foreign degree if this is what they're looking for, and an opportunity, not just a degree as an outcome, but an opportunity to study abroad as well. So the franchisee model suited them, right? So there is a context to it. So of course, there are different strategies and different approaches, but also underpinning them is the context in which, some of these strategic decisions really evolve and which are subsequently adapted.
I think,
and that's a great point. Go ahead, Raj. Go ahead, Raj.
Yes. So, in the interest of time, because we are running into valediction after that, thank you very much for sharing this work. Pretty interesting, especially for a person who is running, who is trying to understand this literature, because he's been given a responsibility to run an incubator on campus. And that's a very interesting idea with 100 startups running around your head. And how do you now work around with them? So some of the key takeaways, especially from a startup angle, which probably if I summarize, one of the things that I found interesting in the first paper is the value. And the value they derived from a land parcel is very different. And probably, we never expected that some people can exploit that. But I think location matters still is something that is very keenly coming out in that paper. And the second aspect that I thought was interesting is turbulence. Because in a turbulent environment, how do you adapt? And from there, I think, if I really see the process of the other two papers, they actually talk about how do entrepreneurs manage these turbulent environments. And from an angle of, how do we entrepreneurs in BOP kind of environments manage, and how do entrepreneurs at a normal stage in emerging markets who face institutional voids manage. So I think both are interrelated to a certain extent, but one is a more specific category than the other. So, and we have all sorts of these enterprises in our incubator. So I think some of these insights that you are deriving is probably helpful for us to tailor make some of the training materials that when we take it to the classrooms. I think I will be in touch with all of you to probably design some specific materials or modules which we can talk to the entrepreneurs as we train them. Because some of the things that you touched upon, and it's also what yesterday Professor Kavil from my Indian School of Business was talking about in the entrepreneurship area. It's basically, how does an entrepreneur in India work? How is he wired differently is one aspect, but how do they work around differently is the other aspect. So I think that part of it is nicely captured. These two parts which your research is focused on will be very useful for a lot many incubators. We will try and probably catch up with you and probably do some short videos on how do we contextualize this to some of these startup companies. Thank you very much. While this is for a set of scholars, I think we can also take it to a set of entrepreneurs. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kundu and Professor Ashish
joining from, bizarre time zones, both of you and others for taking time out and joining as part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajesh.
Pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you, everyone.